Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks, Shelby. You're a real trooper.
Hey.
All right.
He just wanted to say. Oh, did you just see that? Oh, that's.
Happy birthday.
That's not okay.
I'll wait for a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I mean, they
figured
it out.
On pile.
All right. Can you guys all see the screen?
Unfortunately.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm in good.
Okay. So when I got there, this was one of the first things that, so I went with you have to go with a guide through Auschwitz. And we went to, as you'll learn a bit later, it's like Auschwitz is multiple camps, it's multiple spots. So we actually took a bus in the middle of our tour. But you got there and then they gave you like a headset and you set a channel that was set to your tour guide's responder. And so they would speak and you would hear it like loud and clear in your earphones. And this is one of the first things that my tour guide said was this quote. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks when she said that. And so it was probably one of the most overwhelming and moving experiences of my life going to this. And it rained the whole time. Like it was a steady rain the entire time I was there. And it was almost kind of fitting to the mood that I was having and everybody else was. And just the kind of the cold, calculated business of ending people's lives at Auschwitz, I think, is what was just hard for me to wrap my head around. And I actually emailed Mr. Durham last night. He and I have been talking back and forth, and he went to Auschwitz a couple years ago. And we both had a similar understanding, at least initially, of like, you don't know what to think after you've been there. You don't know what to say to anybody. There's like no words. So bear with me as I try and work through this. So just a little bit of the background. Auschwitz was first established in 1940 as a concentration camp. So it was not a death camp at the onset. And it was mainly for Polish political prisoners that were around here. So the Nazis had arrested so many people who were seen as enemies of the state that the local like jails were overcrowded. So they needed a place to put them. So they established a concentration camp at Auschwitz, which is, like I was telling Brady, it's, an hour and a half drive from here. So originally it was just a concentration camp, but later they began deporting lots and lots of people from all over Europe, and specifically Jews, POWs from the Soviet Union, and Gypsies or Roma were the main ones who were sent to Auschwitz. But they came from all over. So this is a picture, and I'm sorry the quality's not fantastic, but this is a picture in the museum, and you can see all the places that people came from Paris in the west to Oslo in the north, to Rome, and all the way to the east into Russia. So people came from all over to Auschwitz, and it was a labor camp. So people who came here had to work, and I learned that many German companies would station their factories near these camps because the labor was so inexpensive. Like one of the big ones was Bayer. So the people that make the aspirin, Bayer aspirin made their drugs near here and used the labor from the labor camps because it was so inexpensive. So anyway, people came from all over the place to Auschwitz, and it was as this shows, it was the largest concentration camp and death camp in Nazi controlled Europe. And the vast majority of people who came here were Jews, and the vast majority of the people who were murdered here were Jews as well. And most of them were killed through the gas chambers, and I'll talk more about those in a little bit. But you can see the groups of people and the vast numbers. Our tour guide kept saying, and the statistic was just startling, that between 8 and 9 of 10 people who came here died. So essentially, if you were sent to Auschwitz, 8 to 9 of the 10 people that you came with weren't going to make it out. And as things went on and the second Auschwitz was built, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, it became basically an extermination camp where people didn't even stay here to work. They were murdered immediately upon their arrival. So again, just a very heavy experience to think of all these victims who came to this place that you're standing. So it was difficult. So like I told you, it was first created in 1940. And there was just one camp, which was now called Auschwitz I. And then in 1941, it was becoming overcrowded. So they made all these additions to Auschwitz. So they turned the barracks or the bunks into 2 stories rather than 1. And that was obviously done with slave labor. And then it continued to be overcrowded. So they built a second camp, which was about 2.5 to 3 miles away from the first one. And it was also a labor camp. So if you were in the first Auschwitz, you would have to walk, 6 miles round trip every day to work at the other camp. And then, meanwhile, you don't have shoes, you don't have barely any clothing. I mean, it was just horrific. And then they built another one in 1942. And in fact, there are a whole bunch of little satellite camps all around that area. And it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. They literally took, so for the second camp, the Nazis literally took a village that existed and took the buildings in the village and tore them down and then used the bricks from that village to build the concentration camp. So the name was Polish, and then they changed the name to something German. So it can't continue to expand and grow as the war years progressed. So this is the kind of the infamous first gate when you walk into Auschwitz I, and the loose translation is that work will make you free. And that, I mean, that is just kind of a painful, mean thing to say, because it, people realized that wasn't really the case. So this is the gate that every day the people would leave to work, and that they would return in after 12 hours of working wherever they were sent. So this is what one of the bunks looked like, and you can kind of see, if you look closely, the brick coloring is different right above the first floor, because that's what was added. So originally this was a 1-story thing, and then they added a second story. And there were probably 20 to 25 of these, and each one was called a block. So you can see this was, you can't tell if that's 6 or 8. But these were intended to house, 700 people, and they had over 1,000 of them, 1,000 people in each one. They used the attic, they used the basement, and it was just very, very close quarters with pretty bad sanitary conditions. Here's the barbed wire fences that separated the camp from the outside, and the guard tower. These were electrified, and people, escaping was not easy, and some people, just killed themselves by throwing themselves against the fence, because it was better than being a prisoner in the camp. And the whole thing, I mean, with the full concrete posts, I mean, it just is so cold. The whole thing is just so cold. Here's just some pictures side by side. This is kind of in the middle of the two fences on the left, with the guard tower down there at the end. And then on the right is block number 10. And block number 10 and block number 11 were pretty bad. So block number 10 is where many of the Nazi doctors did experiments on people, medical experiments. So they would do experiments on twins. So they would take, two sets of twins and do experiments on them and see how things affected twins versus, other people. They would do experiments on women and their reproductive abilities and sterilization. And so a lot of that happened in block number 10. And then to the right of block number 10 is number 11. And block 11 was basically a prison inside of a prison. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But in block number 11, they did a lot of torture experiments and experimented on how to kill people. And then this is a sign, that told people to stop and not try to leave. And just with the guard shack there and everything, it was just a very kind of moving place. So I told you a little bit about this already. Sanitary conditions inside of the blocks were really terrible. The number of bathrooms was way less than what was needed for the number of people in there. So there was a lot of disease that spread because the conditions were so bad. On the left is a bunk, and each one of those beds was where two people had to sleep. So, each bunk could fit 6 people. And then on the right are the toilets, and left of those would be what would be kind of a sink. And you can see there were 5 toilets. And then on the other side, there were 5 more. So you had 10 toilets for, 1,000 people. So you can do the math that it was not nearly what was required for people to use. So block 11 was the death camp or the death block. And so they had different kind of cells within this based on the crime that you were committed of or committed to serve the punishment for. So some of them were ones that had a window, while some of them had no window. Others of them were literally like 1 meter by 1 meter square, and they would put 4 people in there, and you had to stand all night long, and then you went to work the next day, and then you'd come back and stand. And basically that was a death sentence because there was no way you were going to live through that. So you have 4 people, and it was like standing with your arms straight down by your side, and you couldn't move all night long. And then outside of block 11, they had what was called the death wall, and this is where political prisoners, especially early on, were killed by the Nazis through firing squad. So this is a little bit before they started the mass extermination, but when they would kill, mainly at this point, Polish political prisoners. And they also had the gallows where they would hang the prisoners as well. So this is this is in between block 10 and 11. Block 10 is on the right, and you can see that the windows have brown boards in front of them, and that was so people inside block 10 couldn't see what was happening in the courtyard, because this is where everybody was being murdered. And then block 11, which is on the left, was the prison. So this is where they had like a fake court. Everybody was found guilty. And then they were marched down the hall. You had to strip naked. They marched you out into the middle of this courtyard, and you were either tortured or you were killed. And this is the wall of death. So this is what people would stand in front of before they were shot by the firing squad. This isn't the original. This is a remake of it, but this is what it looked like. And again, it's just such an overwhelming experience to see this and be in that spot. These were the gallows, so these were just outside of that block, and this was right in the front. So this is also where they would do the roll call each day. So you had roll call when you left and roll call when you got back from working, and oftentimes these would be public hangings. So you know, they would hang the convicted victims right in front of everybody, and it was fairly long here, so you could hang multiple people at a time. I think the largest one was maybe 14 Poles were killed because of communicating with people outside of the camp. And like I said, the blocks were kind of the home of experiments. So I talked a little bit about the medical experiments, but then the block number 10 or block number 11 is where they began the use of Cyclone B. And that was what was actually used for gassing of the victims. So as you can, I'm gonna go back. Where was it? This is what it looked like. So they came in these big containers that you see on the left, and they're kind of like these little crystals on the right. And this is what essentially was poured into the gas chambers, and then heated to the right amount, it became deadly. And so they tested all these things first in the blocks. So I think some of the most moving things for me was this idea that most of the people who came here were told that they were just being relocated. So like this is on the left, you can see all their luggage, because people brought with them their most prized possessions because they thought they were just being moved here. They didn't realize that they were going to be murdered. So people like on the right there wrote their names on their luggage, thinking that they were going to get them back. And these are the things that were found when the Russians liberated the camp. So this is just what was left over when the Nazis were leaving Auschwitz, not what was there the whole time. And so they would take their luggage and then they would send them usually to the gas chamber. But the tour guide had a survivor on her tour one time, and he said to her, "I want you to imagine if you had 2 minutes to pack everything that you wanted or was important to you and put it in a bag." And that's essentially what he had to do as a young child. And then, you know, he never saw his stuff again, and he survived. So just very, very moving. And then in the same room, there was, I think, one of the hardest things for me to see, because they, when people were taken into the gas chambers right beforehand, they were stripped naked and they were told they were getting a shower, and it wasn't a shower. And then afterwards, they would cut off all their hair, pull out their gold teeth, take out their gold fillings. And there was a room filled with human hair. And there haven't been many times in my entire life, I don't think, where I almost was ready to puke when I saw something. And that was one of them. Like I could not stay in the room. I had to leave. So just the gravity of that was just unbelievable. And then this is a room of like prosthetics. So the people that were allowed to live were those who were able to work. The people who were murdered right away were the ones that couldn't work. So the young, the old, the sick, and the disabled. And so here's, you know, the things that were left over from the people who were disabled and murdered by the Nazis. So are there any questions before we move on? Are you guys still there?
We had the mic muted just to
Okay.
prevent some of the back. So
Are there any questions before we move on?
yeah,
What would they do with the hair? Like, what was the purpose of cutting all their hair off?
Yeah, I want to be able to see you guys. So, the hair they used for a number of things. One was they would actually turn it into like fabric. So they had it looked kind of like a blanket almost that was weaved and made out of human hair. They'd also use it to like stuff pillows. So they had like some would look like throw cushions kind of that they would stuff full with human hair.
The Holocaust Museum in Washington made the decision not to have a similar exhibit of human parts out of respect.
Yeah, I was really taken aback when I walked in there because I've been to the Holocaust Museum in DC, and like you said, Mrs. Lincoln, there wasn't this, and it just was very, very difficult.
Did you see like the baby shoes? Like, is that a thing?
Yeah, they had a whole section that had things that children brought with them. So shoes and toys and dolls and blankets and things like that. And I read one of the survivors talked about seeing like a parade of baby bassinets that the Nazis were rolling out of Auschwitz. And he said it went on for what seemed like an hour because people would show up with babies, you know, and the babies were killed along with their families. And just those bassinets was just such a powerful thing. Mrs. Lincoln, do you have anything you want to add?
Mr. Zimmerman, thank you. You're doing such a phenomenal job with this. We're ready to continue.
Okay. All right, so I got to share my screen again here.
And again, we'll mute the mic while you're doing the screen share, and then when you're ready for questions, just let me know and I'll change it.
Okay. Okay, so like I told you earlier, the camp was first started as a concentration camp. Auschwitz I was a concentration camp where people, local political prisoners were sent. But then it started to become the center for large-scale murder. So again, like I've said, it was just the coldness of the business of murdering other humans, that it was all about efficiency. It was all about the best, most efficient way to take care of murdering another human. That, you know, like firing squad and hanging was not the most efficient. So they began to use the gas chambers, and like I showed you before, they had the little pellets. They tried those out to see what would work best, how much you would need, at what temperature you had to have the room. And so then they started to do murder through gassing. And so the first people that they began to do this with were the Soviet prisoner of war, as well as the Jews from the local area. And you'll remember that initially Russia, or the USSR, and Germany had a non-aggression pact. They weren't going to fight one another. But then Hitler decided that he was going to invade Russia, so that kind of undid that. And so then all those Russians that were kind of in the eastern area of Poland that were captured were sent and were murdered. And so the stoves in Auschwitz I could burn about 350 bodies each day. And again, they were trying to be efficient. So they would have the people go into the gas chamber, they would be gassed, and then they would burn the bodies, but they would, try and fit as many bodies in. So they would put small bodies with larger bodies so they could fit more into a single burning. So this is the gas chamber and the crematoria in Auschwitz I. The ones in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the second camp, were destroyed by the SS when they knew they were going to be taken over, when the Russians were coming to try and cover their crimes. But this one remained. So this is where people would walk in. Again, this is what was used to kill them, and these are just the metal containers that the Russians found. They weren't the ones that this isn't the entire supply over the course of the war. So the bottom of the screen is the door that people would walk into. The top, where you see kind of the light coming in, that's where the gas would come in. These were fixed with shower heads because they thought they were be given a shower, but they weren't. And this was even more the case in the second one than here. And then these were the stoves. So you can see where the people were put in and cremated, and then their ashes were taken out and they were put in various places. And I'll show you when we get to the second Auschwitz camp where that was done. But again, I don't think these pictures and what I'm saying can express the feeling that you have when you're there. So the second camp became pretty much an extermination camp, and people would arrive in cattle cars. So railroad cars intended to move cattle around. Some people, were only in the cattle cars for, a day or so, if they were coming from a location that was geographically pretty close. But other people, like you saw earlier, were shipped from all over the continent. And so if you were coming from Hungary, or if you were coming from far west, you might be in one of these cars for a week. There were no facilities. There was barely any way for air to get in. So many people didn't make it alive to Auschwitz. Many died in the cars. And then once you got there, you had to line up, men on one side, women on the other side. And there would be someone there, a doctor, quote unquote, who would look at you and make a determination immediately whether you were going to live or whether you were going to die. And if it looked like you could work, you went one direction. And if it looked like you couldn't work, you were going to go another direction and go immediately to the gas chambers. And again, it was just such an efficiency thing. And my guide was telling me that when the Nazis took over this village, I mean, they took down all the houses and all that kind of stuff and built new barracks, but they left things like fruit trees because they wanted to give the illusion that this was just going to be relocation. And so these people who had been riding in horrid conditions in a train car would arrive, and they would see these fruit trees and they would be somewhat calmed. And so you would be, on your way to the gas chamber, but you're walking by apple trees and cherry trees and plum trees. And then when you got to the gas chamber, you were told you were getting a shower, and that they even had like hooks in the undressing room where you would hang your clothing. But most of the people who showed up to Auschwitz #2 were immediately sent to the gas chambers. And Auschwitz II was significantly larger, both in size, geographic size, and in number of people. So there were like 100,000 people by August of 1944. So it was significantly larger. So this is the view that you would have if you were, after you had just come through the main gate. So this is if you were looking back, where the train cars would come in, filled with victims from, again, all over the continent. And they would come down these tracks. This is actually an original car. This is not a remake. So this is one that was actually just found several years ago. And this is what would be loaded with victims who were deported from all over Europe. And it would roll up here, it would be open, people would come out, and then this would be the platform where people were sorted, whether they were gonna go into the labor camp portion or they were gonna go directly to the gas chambers. And the gas chambers were probably only maybe 300 to 400 yards from here. So it was not a long walk for people. Like I said, this became mainly a place of murder. So they had 4 permanent crematoria with gas chambers, and then they had 2 temporary gas chambers. And that was not enough. So they also had huge cremation pits. They would take people out into the woods surrounding the camp. They would take the corpses and burn them in huge numbers. And people who lived or who were chosen to live immediately were forced to take the bodies. So, I mean, just the horridness of that. And my guide was saying people who had moved bodies would come across their family, right? They would come across the people that they were related to or their friends, and they had to take them to these huge pits where they were being burned. And then the ashes were spread in all sorts of places. They had ponds, and I'll show you a picture in a second. There was a pond very close to the crematoria. Pits, they spread the ashes in rivers. They put them on the fields. And this is where that first quote comes around, that their problem was not with killing the people, it was dealing with the bodies. So they could put 1,000 people into the gas chambers, but then burning the bodies took more time. And they were more worried about burning the bodies than with taking other humans' lives. And that is just such an intensely hard thing to imagine. So when the Soviets were on the doorstep, the SS knew that they were going to lose the camp, so they began to destroy things. So the crematoria in Auschwitz II is pretty much destroyed, but the picture on the right would have been the dressing room, the undressing room, and that was below ground. So at the far end of that white fence, people would enter into this dressing room. They would undress, and then they would be taken into the gas chamber. The gas chamber was also underground, and that would be on the left-hand side of the picture, or the left picture, right-hand side. And then the crematoria, the stoves, were actually on the left-hand side of the left picture. You can see where some of those, where some of the bricks are higher, and that's where the stove would actually be. This is another picture of where the oven was. And right next to this picture doesn't do a very good job of showing the proximity, but this was an ash pit or a pond where they would take the ashes from the crematoria and put them in this hole. And it was literally 50 yards at the most. So again, it was all about efficiency, how to make this the most efficient way to take another person's life. And then for those who lived, or were chosen to live at first, they had 2 kinds of bunks at Auschwitz II. The first kind were brick ones that were built from the buildings that they took down. And they were kind of probably intended for 50, but they housed 200 to 300 people. They're built without foundations, so the floor was the earth. And Poland gets very, very, very cold in the wintertime. So if the ground freezes, your bed freezes, and you're sleeping on frozen ground with little to nothing in between the two. The second ones were wooden horse stables that got turned into bunks, and they could hold upwards of 400 people, and the sanitary conditions were terrible. There were not enough restrooms. People were only allowed to go to the bathroom twice a day, and actually working in one of the best jobs that you could get would be to be the one who cleaned the bathrooms, because you had a roof over your head. And because it was so rancid and there was so much infection, the guards didn't really go around that area, so you had more freedom if you worked there. But you literally cleaned out the toilets with your hands and removed the waste. But that was the best job, which I think speaks volumes to what these people had to deal with. So many of the wooden ones have since been taken down or fallen apart, but their chimneys and ovens remain. So each of the wooden ones had a chimney at either end like this, which didn't provide much heat and oftentimes were not heated, so they didn't put anything in there to heat them. This is the brick bunks. So on the left would be the stoves at the end. On the right would be the bunks. So there's 3 levels, and each level would have between 3 and 5 people that were sleeping there. So you'd be, that would be 12 to 15 people in each one of these, times however many were in this bunk. So very close conditions, little to no heat, almost no food. They got roughly 1,000 calories a day, and that's not enough to live on. So it's just a slow kind of starvation happening while you have to work. But ending on a positive note, as we were just getting ready to go into the camp, my tour guide was almost startled because this gentleman came up, and he is a survivor of Auschwitz. And he asked the tour guide what language this was, and she told him English. And so he took a minute to speak with us, and he wanted to thank us for coming and learning, and that it was our responsibility to make sure that what we were about to see would never happen again. And it was just an amazingly emotional and overpowering thing to hear from this man, and for him to thank us for coming to learn about it so we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And after I had gone through the whole thing, I thought to myself, I don't know how anybody would live. I don't know how there are survivors of Auschwitz. But this person that we met was one, and it was pretty powerful. And it doesn't. My guide said it does not happen very often that that there is a survivor there who will talk to the group even for a couple minutes. So amongst all of this really horrible stuff, there was this very positive moment from this guy. So I'm gonna turn off this and come back to you guys to see if there are some questions and stuff.
All right, microphone's
All
back.
right.
We have, Jake, just to let you know, we got about 6 minutes till the bell rings here, so just
Okay.
get cut off.
Any questions or thoughts?
I have a question. How close is Auschwitz to like the nearest city, or is it just kind of like separated? Did they try to keep it separate from where people live, or did they not even care?
So they picked this location for a couple reasons. One was it was already a Polish kind of military outpost, so some stuff was already there. So when the Germans came in, it was convenient for that. Second thing is it was kind of already a thoroughfare for the railroads. So knowing they were going to need supplies and knowing at some point they were probably going to begin deporting people to here in large numbers, they built it along the railroad. And thirdly, it was far enough off the beaten track so that it was kind of under the radar a little bit. And I was reading some correspondence between a couple of high up people in the Nazi regime, and they were talking about the idea of this was a good location, and the word they use is because we could camouflage it from the outside. So they picked this location because of a couple things, but one of which being it was far enough away from major cities that people didn't, at least initially, people didn't really know what was happening. But, you know, word spread and people, the outside world, the British knew that this was an extermination camp.
So they sold all the stuff, right, that they took? Like that's how they like kept the camp running, they sold it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You mean like they're like the
stuff they brought, right? Because they brought stuff thinking they were relocated. So they didn't like just keep, they sold that, right? Like
Yep.
Like the German government property, or did they like sell that to shopkeepers and stuff?
A little bit of both. They would send things that were valuable, they would send back to Germany and be put in the trust, which really meant the Nazis did whatever they wanted with it. I learned that in Krakow, when Jews were put into the ghetto, the Germans would take all the things that were in their homes and sell them to other Germans or people who were still free. But you had to pay in German marks, so it was just another way for them to make money. And some stuff that they didn't want. Any observations?
It was really fitting and appropriate that you should see that survivor at the end. And again, a way of, if it's at all possible, to have some sense of positiveness and hope. Thank you for sharing that. And again, words are failing me, but this is one of the most incredible presentations I've heard. I've been there, and in a very short time, you were able to impart to us what you experienced and learned. So thank you, and we'll continue on, and it makes more sense now. Thank you.
Yeah. If you get the opportunity, everyone in this room, in that room, should come here, because it literally changes. It changes the way you see the world and what our responsibility in the world is. So you need to all add it to your bucket list, because it will change your life. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's true. I mean, you really need to come and just be present in the moment with other people and the things that are happening around you, because it's something that can't be reproduced unless you're here. It's about time for them to go.
Yeah, it's gonna be 1 minute, but a lot of this, when we watch Schindler's List on Monday, we'll tie in.
Yeah. Yep. All right, guys and gals, have a lovely weekend.
Okay, safe travels to Istanbul.
Thank you.
All right.
You're gonna stop and
I'll stop the broadcast.